Okay, so we're going to start at chapter 5 tonight. You know, as I said last week, many people talk about the first 3 or 4 chapters of Revelation, but it's not that often that people actually make it beyond there. You know, you get the letters to the churches, and then you get this vision of worship in heaven, and that's one of my favourite passages. But it's kind of self-explanatory. It doesn't need a great deal of teaching on that, but it's something I think it's always worth just like dwelling on, savouring for yourself, and enjoying what is actually an insight or a snapshot of the worship in heaven. So we're going to go to Revelation chapter 5. We're going to start there. We'll go off in a couple of little rabbit warrens, but I'm trying to look really at Revelation chapters 5 and 6 tonight as far as I can get. So I'll start with chapter 5. In my Bible, it's headed The Scroll and the Lamb. So it's Revelation chapter 5, and I'm beginning at verse 1. Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look at it. And I began to weep loudly, because no one was found worthy to open and read the scroll or to look in it. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and to loose the 7 seals." And I saw a lamb in the midst of the throne and of the 4 living creatures, and in the midst of the elders, standing as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. There's a lot of 7s. I'll explain that shortly. He came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. When he'd taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll, to open its seals. For you were slain, and you have redeemed us to God by your blood, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made us kings and priests unto our God, and we shall reign on the earth." Then I looked, and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders and the voice of many angels, numbering 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands, saying in a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and riches, wisdom and strength, and honour and glory and blessing." Then I heard every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and in the sea, and all of them saying, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honour and glory and power forever and ever." And the 4 living creatures said, "Amen." And the 24 elders fell down and worshipped him who lives forever and ever. Just an absolutely magnificent passage. But the passage itself begins with this kind of conundrum in that causes John to weep, because he can't find, they couldn't find anybody who could open these seals on the scroll. And so in verse 1, we have, "Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll written within on the back, sealed with 7 seals. Now, a couple of things that we could miss there if we skimmed over it, but it's important that we see that it's talking about that this is all taking place. So the focus is on somebody who is on the right hand of God. And the right hand of God is where Jesus sits to await his kingdom. Right through the Bible, the right hand of God is described as the place of favour. And what we've got here is a picture of Jesus waiting in this place of favour, sitting, awaiting to come into his kingdom. And this long period of waiting to come into his kingdom is about to end. And then we find out that this scroll that he's referred to, that's sealed with 7 seals. So you remember, as I was reading through it, there's a lot of 7s. Now, 7 is kind of an important number biblically. 7 is the number of completion. So what that indicates is that this is the complete or the perfection or the fulfillment of all things. We're about to see the opening of the things that will make everything perfect. And it's really important to remember that we're about to see something that's going to ultimately result in the fulfillment of all prophecies and to make everything perfect and complete and totally restored. Because as we get into Revelation, it's really easy to see that that's the end point, really easy to miss that that's the end point, because there's a lot of things that are going to happen, that are prophesied, that we kind of wish were in there. So we need to understand that what we're about to see are things that are necessary to bring about the fulfillment and completion of all things. And that's why this number 7 is all so prevalent. It's the number that refers to completion or perfection. And we've got this scroll that's got these 7 seals on it. That word translated scroll is actually the word biblion, which actually means book. And in this scroll, when this scroll is opened, we see the start and the fulfillment of all the great prophetic streams that we have seen coming through the Bible. So all those things that we've talked about in the 16 weeks up to now, this being week 17, all those prophecies are now about to come to fulfillment when these seals are broken. And John's looking around, and everybody's looking around in heaven, and initially they can't find anybody to open these seals. So why are these seals important? Why does this start everything? If you remember, and you need to go back several weeks now, when we looked at Daniel, there's a couple of important statements at the end of Daniel, and these are in Daniel 12. But one in particular, starting at Daniel 12, verse 4, says this, you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Okay, so what I want to say about that is twofold, well, threefold really, that these things that were prophesied in Daniel were sealed until the time of the end. So the question that they're looking at in heaven is who is going to open that sealing of these prophecies so that the time of the end can begin. And they're looking for one who is worthy to open the seals on these prophecies that were sealed up to the time of end. When it says sealed up, it doesn't mean kind of hidden. We can't read them. We can read them. It just means that they can't actually occur until that seal is again opened. And that word for sealing, it's, I guess some of us are old enough to remember when you used to put a wax seal on letters. You used to melt some wax, and then every family had a little thing, and you used to stamp it across the parcel or whatever, and it couldn't be opened again until it arrived at the destination. And when the person got that parcel with your seal on it, they could tell that nobody had opened it, which is a good thing, because, half the time now our post arrives, it's all bashed, it's wet, it's, there's bits torn off corners of envelopes with all these machines. But the idea here is that God has said, this is what is going to happen. This is what will happen when I bring all things to perfection. He's approved that plan and he's put his seal on it. And until that seal is open, nothing changes. That plan, it remains intact. No detail of it changes. Nothing changes, but it comes into action when that seal is broken. So what we're looking at is that seal on those prophecies that were given to Daniel, those things we've talked about in early weeks. And now the seals on these scrolls that open up this prophecy are going to be broken. And the breaking of those seals is going to have certain effects that begin to open up that which was prophesied by Daniel, those last 7 years. And just the second reason I went back to that phrase in Daniel is it's got a funny throwaway comment at the end of it. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Now, a lot of people read that and they say, well, that must be a sign of the end. You know, we live in this time period where, you know, we've got exponential growth in knowledge, information, and so on. You know, we're accumulating more knowledge at a rate that has never been seen before. So we must be nearing the time of the end. I don't actually think that's what that passage or that phrase refers to. I think what it actually refers to is something that was prophesied also by Amos. And Amos, and I'll give you the reference, it's Amos chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. We're not going to look at them, but basically what Amos said is that there would be a day that would come when there would be a famine of correct teaching of God's word and knowledge of God's word. That there would be a famine amongst the people of God of knowing his word. And Amos prophesies this, and he says that the result of that famine is that people will run here, they will run there, they'll go all over the place in order to find this thing that has gone missing. And the thing that starts to open that up, according to Amos, open up this knowledge that answers the things that people have, is the teaching of the prophecies of the Old Testament as they come to fulfillment. So I think what Daniel's saying there is that at just before the time of the end, people will be looking because they won't be able to, there's no knowledge of the word in the same way as God would have wanted it. And they're looking for that. But really, people's hearts are opened up when they start to understand and realize what the prophecies are actually saying and where we're all heading to. And I think that's really interesting. You know, I found that personally interesting in terms of what I've said before, which is, you know, very, very few people actually teach this or preach any of this or talk about much of this in church these days. Whereas, you know, going back earlier generations, people talked about these things a lot, but we don't now. And there isn't, for all the talk about the prophetic, there is an absence of knowledge of the prophecies and in terms of biblical prophecy. Now, the next thing that I want to kind of talk about is that these, how can I put it? What this opening of the scrolls that he's talked about in the first few verses, it gets linked in verses 9 and 10 to the fact of redemption. So whatever is going to happen as a result of this train of events that starts by opening these seals, the end point is redemption. And it took, you know, that's verse 9. You were slain, you have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And that's why they start giving glory to Jesus, honoring Jesus, because of this event, redemption. And that the opening of these scrolls, the breaking of these seals is inherently related to that redemption purpose. As these get opened and as the return of Jesus approaches, what Jesus is actually, one of the things he is coming back for is that which he has purchased and already paid for. And, you know, in this sense, we kind of cross over a bit about what we're talking about on Thursdays at the moment with kingdom and now and not yet, because there's certain things Jesus has paid for, which he has not yet taken possession of. And this purchase was made at the cross, and this scroll is actually the deed of purchase. When you open it, it gives effect to Jesus returning to take ownership of the whole world, to set things right, to put things right, take ownership of the whole world. There's an example of that actually kind of a type and shadow of that idea in the Old Testament, and it's in Jeremiah chapter 32. And in Jeremiah, he's talking about where Babylon's besieged Jerusalem, and God tells Jeremiah to go out and purchase a plot of ground in Israel. And he explains to Jeremiah that even though Israel has fallen to Babylon, this purchase of this plot of land, this prophetic purchase of this plot of land, demonstrates the reality of God's promise to ultimately restore Israel back to the land. And in that sense, it's kind of a type or a shadow of what we're looking here, which is that Jesus paid for the whole world in advance. But there's a period which intervenes between that payment and the taking of possession of the world. And that taking of possession of the world awaits a future date, which starts, the beginning of it all starts when this first seal is opened up. So I don't know, does that make sense? That's kind of a very quick précis to try and give you a bit of background about what's going on here. So John, he already knows that these scrolls will reveal the end of history. He's been, he knows he's Daniel, and he's been waiting for this, and he's taken into the heavenly realm, and he's shown these scrolls. And the reason that he's upset is that he knows it requires a human being to partner in releasing those end time events. And the angel comes along and he tells John, you don't need to weep, because God has found a human being that he can trust to bring about these end time things. Now, it's a little bit of a strange idea for us to get our head around, but the enormity of what we're going to see in Revelation is beyond what sometimes our minds can really take, what it will actually feel like at the time. But it is an immense display of God's power, God's judgment, God's redemption purposes, all woven into one and packed down into 7 years. And it's not just who's worthy to open the scrolls, but it's who is worthy to open the scrolls and see this through. And so John's pointed by the angel to this figure, and he's given this mixed figure, who is also he's both the Lion of Judah and he's the Lamb who was slain. And that can be kind of a misleading picture for us, because we get the idea of like a little fluffy lamb when we use this word lamb, but the actual word is translated there is it's a fully grown lamb where the horns have already come. So it's a powerful, it's not just like a lay down and be fluffy and make wool sort of lamb. Both are powerful pictures. And when this lamb, who is also the Lion of Judah, is revealed, the worship starts in heaven, because at last they've found somebody who can be trusted with the power to bring this world to an end in a right and proper way. Now, just imagine if anybody else who wasn't worthy got trusted with that level of power. So Jesus is the only one who can do this. Therefore, all this timing is in Jesus's hands. He said when he was on earth, he didn't know the timing, but actually what we discover is he starts the clock. At the right moment, he starts to open the scrolls. So why is Jesus worthy? Well, we go, well, because he's Jesus. That it's kind of, yeah, but what is it about Jesus that makes him worthy? Why is there only one person in the whole of creation, the whole of the universe, only one man who can do this? And that's because Jesus is perfect. Remember, this is about to bring about or start the chain of events that bring about the fulfillment, bring about the perfection. And it starts with the only one who is perfect. And the reason for that, it's kind of multiple reasons. Firstly, that Jesus is the only one who can actually judge. Because all of us are mixed up. We don't necessarily have perfectly balanced motives. We don't have knowledge. We don't have omniscience. We don't know everything. We can't understand everything. We can't understand the vast scope of the whole of creation and the whole of God's plan. And only Jesus is able to exercise perfect judgment over every single life. And the second reason it's Jesus is that this needs to be a man. So whilst Jesus is now fully in heaven, whilst he's fully God, whilst he sits at the right hand of God, he's totally in the image of God, the fullness of the entire Godhead dwells in him, he is also a man. There is a man who sits on this throne in heaven. And the reason it needs to be a man is that, again, crossing over a little bit with what we're talking about on Thursday, is that Adam lost dominion. He was given dominion on the earth. He was given a tenancy, a stewardship of the earth over all the living creatures and all the things of the earth. And he was placed in his perfect place, and he lost that dominion. And Satan usurped that tenant position on earth. Satan was given authority. He was given ability to influence things on the earth. And he became what Paul calls the God of this world. And we can tell that, can't we? Because like when he offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, Jesus doesn't say, well, you can't do that. Jesus actually, by implication, acknowledges Satan's right that, yeah, he has got the nations of the world. And Satan remains in possession of the unbelieving world until this perfection comes right at the end. This fulfillment of all the prophecies. So the kingdom hasn't come fully. There's still this possession to be taken of the earth. There's a physical possession, and that can only be done again by a man, not just any man, but the perfect man. Thirdly, why? Because he's the only one who's paid for this possession. He's the one who has paid for this. He is the one who's made the payment, the redemption price to take back that land which Satan previously possessed. So it's not just like he snatches it off Satan unwarrantedly. He's actually paid the price to redeem. It is his, and he is coming back one day soon to take possession of what is rightfully his. But he hasn't done that yet. And therefore, we see a world where evil still has influence, where the enemy is still very active, where souls are still choosing to follow after the ways of the enemy and after our own flesh and our own selfish desires. And the fourth thing about Jesus is that he's got the right to possess. He has to have the ability to possess. It's okay saying, well, I've paid for it, but he actually has the ability. Somebody has to have the ability to enforce that when the enemy tries to oppose it. And Jesus has all authority on earth and under the earth and in heaven. So all authority is given to Jesus. And so there's just this unveiling of the purposes of God. How did Jesus get that worthiness? Well, we could do a kind of a 6 weeks Bible study on this, but I'll just really kind of try and put it into 3 points. Firstly, he became a man, so he made himself of no reputation. So, this is from Philippians chapter 2. Made himself of no reputation, emptied himself of all the equality, the access to the things of heaven, came down, emptied himself, been born in the likeness of man, becomes a human being, and then he comes not as a conquering king, but as a servant. The point of him being a servant is he actually chooses that status. The God of the universe chooses servant. And, I've been really challenged with this just the last couple of weeks in my own personal studies, my own personal time with God, in that, when Jesus asks us to be servants, he isn't saying, there's these big guys up there and they're your leaders, but really they're there to serve you. He's actually saying the attitude of, it's the other way around, the attitude of any true leader, the attitude of any true believer is he is a servant of all. So Jesus' measure of leadership is of how much of ourselves we give to others in order to enable them to grow and find Christ and to grow in their walk with him. So Jesus equates leadership with how much of ourselves we give to help others. That's his definition of leadership. But we have this idea of leadership being somebody who's got a title and he's got to do it in a nice, kind fashion because he's supposed to be a servant. But actually Jesus is saying, no, it all works, because the goal here is everybody has servant hearts. If everybody gets to the point of servant hearts, we've cracked it, and all the problems in the church go away. And so he becomes as a man, he chooses to be a servant, and then he suffers this shameful and horrid death. And Philippians 2 verse 8 says, being found in appearance of man, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. So, therefore, God highly exalted him. Literally, that word there is super exalted. God super exalted him. He put him not just above all things, but way, way above all things. Jesus isn't even in the same league as anything else. He's so far above and beyond that everything else, everything of the enemy is tiny and insignificant in comparison, because God has super exalted him. And that's why they just keep going, you're worthy, you're worthy, you're worthy. Why is he worthy? Because he came and became a servant to all and died for all. That's what makes him worthy. And as a result that he had that heart attitude, God super exalted him. And God promises the same thing to us, because that passage in Philippians starts with this: have this mind which was also in Christ Jesus. That God resists the proud and he gives grace to the humble. And that's always been his method. So our goal is not to pursue position or status. Our goal as real believers is to pursue humility and give God make sure God gets all the glory. And so that's chapter 5. Now, what happens is that we start to move into chapter 6, and we start to get bad news. So I just, some of the things that we're going to read about in chapter 6, we're already familiar with. So we're going to see the same things that we've been seeing for the last 16, 17 weeks. We're going to see wars, we're going to see famine, we're going to see plagues and illness, we're going to see earthquakes, and we're going to see martyrs. Now, once we get further in, we're going to see some other things that are a bit more difficult to understand. Revelation talks about some things that they're actually quite difficult for us to get our head around. And as a result, a lot of people say, oh, it must all be figurative speech, or it must all be imagery and not real. For instance, one of the things that comes along, after these seals are broken, in the next set of things, is that the seas of the world, the oceans, turn blood red. You see that in chapter 8, verse 8, the oceans turn blood red. And people go, well, that must be sort of imagery or whatever. Well, let me show you something. I'll just screen share for a moment and I'll show you this. That is the ocean off Camargue in France in 2012. And it's totally red. I mean, that was actually a photo because they thought it was so astounding. That is a photo that appeared in the Daily Mail on the 9th of August 2012 of a blood red ocean. So the oceans can turn blood red. And what it's caused by is high levels of salt in the water. So that certain types of plankton thrive in those conditions when the salt levels get out of sync. And apparently this is becoming increasingly common as the climate shifts around the earth. And they thrive and they grow, but they also suck out all the oxygen out of the water, and everything else dies. This is it's not a very good colour, but this is actually mist on. This is a pinky red sea. This is the same plankton. This is what's called a red tide. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a red tide, but they form over hot air vents under the sea. And the stuff that these hot air vents kick out feed this plankton. Again, this red coloured plankton thrives in that, sucks all the oxygen out of the water. Everything else dies, but the sea turns red. And that's actually a photo out of National Geographic, and that was off the coast of Florida. So they had a big problem with red tide several years ago outside Florida. And they actually have to take action to control these now, because left to themselves, they've become virtually unstoppable once they started. So actually, this now requires men to intervene to make that happen. We also have, I'll just stop the share there. We also have things that get referred to in Revelation. For instance, there are epidemics. We're going to see that in chapter 6, that kill 1/4 of humanity. And then there's a second epidemic that kills 1/3 of the remainder. And we go, well, is that really realistic? Well, I guess when I taught this in Bible school a few years ago, I wasn't thinking COVID. And you know, the whole world has taken action to try and stop the spread of this thing. But you know, what I was talking about when I taught this in Bible school a few years ago is that actually in some countries, for instance, the one that we have connections with, which is in Uganda, AIDS has wiped out at least 1/3 of the population. It's wiped out a whole generation over the last 20 or 30 years. So that's why you get a lot of churches and a lot of orphanages out there, because there are grandparents and there are children, but there's no parental generation. You know, the church that we relate to, Faithlife Uganda, they have about 100 people in that church, which is like 20 elderly people and a load of kids. And there's hardly anybody in that middle generation. And when you go around, you go like, where are the 40 and 50-year-olds? And they're not there because of the impact of AIDS, you know, 10, 15 years ago. The other one that we see as we get into Revelation, which I guess we're now more familiar with, but people used to say, well, that can never happen, is you've got a society that is described that runs entirely without cash. Now that's kind of interesting these days, isn't it? When nobody will do anything apart from contactless very much. So we are rapidly going towards a cashless society where the economy can be controlled and the trading of goods can be controlled really easily. So a lot of things that people thought, well, you know, you read it in isolation and you go, well, that's not real, that can't happen. They're actually really very real. A lot of the things that get described in Revelation, although they are rare, they occur even today, but there will be a greater scale of them. And let's start on. Let's go to chapter 6, because we're going to see what happens when these seals start to get opened. I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see what is inside." And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forth conquering that he might overcome. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come and see." Then another horse that was red went forth. Power was given to him who sat on it to take peace from the earth, causing people to kill one another. Then a great sword was given to him. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there was a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's wages and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And then he opened the fourth seal. I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. So I looked, and there was a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed him. Power over a fourth of the earth was given to them to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Who knows what these guys are called? The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There they are in Revelation chapter 6. Have you ever wondered where the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse came from? Where the Hammer movies get all these scary things from? It's from Revelation chapter 6. And we've got this opening of these seals. Now, the first thing I want you to see is that what I've described there, and also for the 5th and 6th seals, or they're slightly different, is that what is described here is no different from what is actually happening throughout the whole of history. What is different is the scale of the thing. Remember when we looked at those signs Jesus said about things leading up to the time of the end, and it includes wars, famines, people falling away from church, plagues, pestilences, all those sort of things. We've got those, and this is the culmination of all these things. Remember, this is the fulfillment. This is this is the end game that we have now entered when this first seal, from when the point where this first seal gets broken. But what we've got here are those same things, but on an unprecedented scale. Now, why do I think that's, well, I personally find that really interesting. And the reason I find it interesting is, if you remember, when we were back in Matthew 24 and looking at the signs of the end, Jesus told them, and when the gospel is preached throughout the earth, then the end will come. And then he says, therefore, when the abomination of desolation, you see it standing where it ought not, then you need to start, then you're in trouble. Then the real tribulation begins. Now, when you look at these prophecies, you find out actually that's 3.5 years in to that 7-year end period. And so I was looking at that Matthew 24 and I'm going, well, why did he not start with the point that where the Antichrist appears and all these things start unwinding? Why did he wait till 3.5 years in? And there's this gap that I'm kind of like going, why is that there? Why did he not say when the Antichrist appears? Why did he say something that's 3.5 years in? And I think it's twofold. Firstly, it's because there is no direct persecution of the church until 3.5 years in. And we'll see that from the other seal judgment. The church is not put under any pressure at all. In fact, the church is just accepted. It's just there. There's no persecution of the church till 3.5 years in. But there's still, we can see from here, there's still this turning of groups against each other. There's turmoil. There's peace established across the earth, but there's still increasing tensions. There's polarization taking place. So what we've got is actually a time when the church can exist side by side with the world. The world thinks it's at peace, but actually certain things are starting to build up, famine, plagues, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, and they're getting bigger and bigger. And when I asked God about this and I was searching, what the thing that dropped in my heart is that in that first 3.5 year period, we probably might still not then even be sure we're in the last 7 years. Because it just looks like the previous ones, only worse. It's a bigger plague. It's a bigger virus. It's a more contention, more social unrest. A polarization that takes place in the earth, where those, remember we looked at where those factions rise against each other, where everybody gets more polarized, more entrenched. And that's what we see in here. We see this final ascent of man, the flowering of sin, the rise of atheism, and so on. So I just want to show you something in that about the conditions that where you have that contention between so many groups of people, the activity of these horses bringing famine, bringing death, people rising against each other. I just wanted to show you a couple of, one thing here that I thought you might be interested in. When I talked about this, I had not seen this chart. So when I talked about it in earlier weeks, I talked about the polarization of views, that ethnic group rising against ethnic group, ideology rising against ideology. There is a culture on the earth that finds its fulfillment in these first 3.5 years, which is division amongst mankind. Polarization, not just an attempt to understand, but polarization where I'm right, you're wrong. I'll just show you something. This is quite a nice little graphic if it works. This is our beloved friends across the Atlantic, the Americans. And this is a surveys that were done of the policies and people's views, where people stood in terms of their political stance. So they basically did a research, and they looked at everybody about what they understood by the policies of the party that they supported and party they didn't support, and where people stood and how they felt about each other's parties. So in 1994, you can see, whilst there's a bit of difference, you've got people over here who talk, very liberal people over here who very fundamental conservatives, but most of the political ground, and this had been the case since the American Declaration of Independence, most of the political grounds is fairly close together. There's not, whilst there's a difference, there's not a lot of difference between the middle of the Democrats and the middle of the Republicans. So that's in 1994. When we get to, let's say, 2004, look what happens. It shifted a little bit, but there's still not a lot of difference. 2011, oh, it's moving. 2015 moves further. 2017. This is where we find ourselves now, where everybody's views has become polarized. So that is a common phenomenon that sociologists now recognize, which is there is a massive polarization taking part in society, where you're wrong and I'm right. There are only two views on anything, and if you don't agree with my view, you're the wrong one. They kind of looked at how that's coming about, but this is kind of the society which gives rise to the man of lawlessness, the coming of the Antichrist. I was reading this book, which I'll show you, which is a really interesting book. It only came out last year, called Rising, that you've probably seen that back to front, haven't you? It's called Rising Tides. And it's actually by a Christian writer. He looks at different ideas about what it means to be the church in our day. And he's a guy called Neil Cole, and he wrote this book. And one of the things he's talking about is the effect of this polarization on the church and where it's come from. And what he quotes is that there's a Harvard professor called Sunstein, and what he's done is he's traced a lot of this polarization to the advent of the internet, which shouldn't surprise any of us, I don't suppose, but it does surprise us, because when I read this, I thought, oh my goodness, Because what we've done with the internet is effectively we've created what he calls echo chambers. What is an echo chamber? That is, an echo chamber is where partisan people only hear their own beliefs be reflected back to them. And so their biases and their prejudices are endlessly enforced. And so, you know, you get this polarization where we move from extreme liberal to neo-Nazi, and we're moving further and further across in that polarization in our societies. And what this study did is it looked at the political sites on the internet and realized that how much more polarized they were becoming, and said, well, why is that? And that's because people have the ability now to create their own echo chambers. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram, you've created an echo chamber for yourself because nearly everybody that you are friends with agrees with you. And you are seeing very little of other people's views. And therefore you're having your own biases reflected back to you. And if somebody gets out of your line of your biases, they annoy you, and most people just then block them and intensify the reflection of their own biases and their own partisan beliefs. And the problem with that is that not only do we do that ourselves, but the internet does it for us. So the internet reinforces our own echo chamber. How does it do that? It tracks, and it will right now be tracking exactly what I am saying. It's tracking what you're saying around your house. It's tracking what websites you've gone on to. You've accepted all the cookies in order to get onto wherever. And you're going to have adverts tomorrow for the things you talked about today. But not only that, but Google and all the other search engines, they're putting content in front of you because they think you'll agree with it and you will buy it. So there's an automatic thing now built into all the search engines which reinforces our echo chambers. So when our picture of the world comes through the internet or very small group of sources, and all our friends are people that agree with us, what we're actually doing is not seeing the world as it really is at all. And that I thought when I kind of started working through that, for me, I thought that is really scary. And yet we've done it to ourselves. And that's why the world is polarizing. That's why we are seeing so many protests, so much misunderstanding, so much polarization of belief. We're seeing people aggressively pushing beliefs on each other, and the world is going like that, and that gives rise to this man, the man that I call the man of lawlessness. He steps into that scenario. Why is that all relevant here? Well, let's go to chapter 6, verse 1. I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, then I heard the four living creatures saying, Come and see. And I looked, there before me was a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forth conquering that he might overcome. Now, let's pick the essence of it. He's riding a white horse. He's wearing a crown, and he goes out and overcomes. And people go, oh, that's Jesus. That's not Jesus. Why is that not Jesus? Well, here's why this isn't Jesus. It's because, firstly, yes, they both do ride a white horse. But this guy, he wears a crown. Jesus, when he is described, wears multiple crowns. The weapon of this guy is a bow. Jesus actually has a two-edged sword coming from his mouth. This one, power is given to him. It's not his power. This is the Antichrist. This is his first appearance, where we see him from a heavenly perspective, not from an earthly perspective. Now, let's go back to something we talked about several weeks ago. Do you remember, if you were around, do you remember we talked about the restrainer? And until the restrainer is taken out of the way, the Antichrist isn't revealed. Well, here we have a seal being broken and a scroll opened, and the Antichrist is no longer restrained. The seal is taken out of the way. So the spiritual reality, the heavenly reality that's reflected on the earth, that's Jesus saying, now is the time for the restraining to be taken out of the way. And the Antichrist comes. Does that make sense? And the Antichrist comes, you know, we find, sorry, I've lost my track of my thought. The
screen has been taken away.
And what we find is that although the Antichrist is totally evil, he's actually portrayed as an instrument that God uses to bring about God's purposes to bring completion to all things. You know, like Pharaoh was used, although Pharaoh was evil, Pharaoh hardened his heart against God, Pharaoh rejected God, God still used him to bring about his purposes. So God's in charge here. God uses the Antichrist to bring about the fulfillment of all things. And the fulfillment of all things, there's several aspects to it. Firstly, he breaks and brings to an end the rebellion of Israel. It's the actions of the Antichrist that bring about the softening of hearts of Israel so that they start to turn back to God in this final time period. So that's the first thing. Second purpose is God uses it as an instrument of judgment on the world. Why is that? God judges the world, finally, the final judgment that we have here, by giving the world what the world desires, the kind of ruler that the world desires. When the Antichrist comes, he will be the kind of ruler that the world as a whole wants. He will be the one who says, I can give you everything you want. You don't need that God. And so, you know, you see that pattern several times in Scripture where people go so far away from God that as a last resort, he gives them what they want in order that they can see the consequences of that, and some will turn back to him. God's final throw of the dice in rescuing mankind is to give them what they want so that they can see how bad it is. So although this is judgment, it is also grace. It has an element of grace because God is giving mankind what they want in the hope that some will return to him. And the third thing it does is it exposes the world's unbelief and demonstrates mankind's lack of faith in God. And finally, the fourth thing it brings about, the Antichrist brings about, it brings a final showdown between rebellious man, the forces of darkness, and Jesus Christ. And that final showdown we'll get to in a few weeks. That's called Armageddon, because it takes place on a plain called Megiddo. And in the language that's written, that the plain of Megiddo, the word is Armageddon, and it means plain of Megiddo. And so this final battle takes place there. So that's the white horse. You've then got the second seal that's opened. You've got bloodshed, lives lost on a horrific scale because these polarized ideologies, nations, ethnic groups all start to fight each other. You've got, on the back of that, you've got famine, you've got shortages. And we even get told that things get so bad that the cost of buying food at that time is 1 day's wage for a small measure of barley, about that much. That's the scale of the famine that comes along on the back of this strife and unrest on the earth. And from that, you then get floods, and all these things come along on a staggering scale. You find in verse 7, the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. So I looked, and there was a pale horse, and the name of him is Saturday. It was death, and Hades followed it. Power over a fourth of the earth was given to them to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. So by perfectly natural things, war, famine, hunger, sicknesses, a quarter of the earth's population is going to die in those 3.5 years, which is just incredible. If you think of the scale of that number, it's about 1.7 billion people. What is happening? The fullness of sin, the fullness of death, the fullness of the sickness of creation, the fullness of man's rebellion is now all reaping its fruit. God is not doing this in isolation. This is the reaping of what has been sown by generation upon generation, and it is all getting released at once. This is death coming. This is sin coming. This is rebellion coming to its fullness. Remember, God stayed his hand. You know, when he talks about in the parables, he talks about the wheat and the tares growing together. He's not judging every single sin and every wrongdoing and every sort of corrupt nation or corrupt person. He's not doing that. The two are growing together. The two kingdoms are alongside each other. But eventually, at this point, in these final 7 years, everything, every bad thing, every sin, every unfairness, every mistreatment, every lie, every murder, everything gets what that has produced, sin and death, and the wages of sin and death. And as these seals get opened, those wages of sin and death, the earth reaps what has been sown for generations. That's what is happening here. We are opening things up that have been held back. And what we'll find, if we're alive, then we will find that what we see is on a staggering scale. You know, much more than how many million people is it now that have been diagnosed with COVID? Is it 28 million or something, heading towards 30 million? I don't know where this stops, but that's kind of a little taster of, it's not 1.5 billion, but you've got the whole mixture. You've got wars, you've got famines, you've got unrest, you've got extremism, you've got economic collapse, you've got disease, pestilence, and they're all coming through there. But the Antichrist isn't doing this. Satan isn't doing this. It's us, mankind, reaping what mankind has sown for generations. This is the justice that the martyrs have demanded. This is the justice we've asked for in our prayers, and it's starting to come. I'm going to have to stop there. So next week we'll just finish off this chapter 6, and then we'll move on a bit further. But they're the first 4 things. That there's another 3 seals to go. And the reason that's a good place to stop, and I'm going to explain why I believe this next week, is there's 3 lots of judgments, or 3 lots of 7s in Revelation. There's the seals, there's the bowls, and the trumpets and the bowls. And when you read it, you can get the impression that you've got 7 lots of seals, 7 lots of trumpets, and 7 lots of bowls, and one starts after the other. I don't having looked at this myself now, and this is kind of just something that I have slightly changed my view on since I taught this in the Bible school. I think these things run coterminous to a large extent. And these 4 things that I've looked at tonight, I believe that they're in the first 3.5 years. And when we get to the 5th and 6th and 7th, I believe that they sit in the second 3.5 years. And they culminate with the big blast of the trumpet and a massive cataclysm on the earth. And the reason I believe that, which I'll explain in detail next week, is that when we get to the fifth seal, the persecution of the church starts. And that doesn't start till the Antichrist breaks his agreement of peace. And then he turns on the church and he turns on the Jews. And that's in the second 3.5 years, according to Daniel. And so I think these first four we see in the first 3.5 years. And I think because they're all things that mankind has seen before, just on a bigger scale, we just think the earth's in a terrible place. And the only person that can bail us out of this is that guy on the white horse called the Antichrist. And so he rides in on the back of that to popular acclaim. He's revealed and we give him power. And we voluntarily give him power. And yeah, I'll leave it there. So you've managed to get to chapter 6, and Revelation's not that complicated, is it? When you get into it, it's just scary. It's huge. It's like better than the best Hollywood movie. It's kind of even bigger than Avengers Endgame, this one. But the nature of Revelation is, if you read it for what's there, I don't think it is too difficult to understand. There's some things, a few things that we just don't know. But Revelation actually tells you won't know. So most things it explains. I think it's just we struggle to get our head around the scale of things and think therefore it's imagery. But I don't think it is. I think this is all real.